Aaron is actually the co-founder and CTO of Liminal AI, who is a company that's building different techniques, which we're going to talk about, helping companies build these secure LLM systems. So I guess before we dive into it, first let's talk about what these risks are themselves. So what are the things we need to be thinking about when it comes to building LLM-based systems? Because they are quite different than just traditional software. Now we have this behemoth model involved in the mix. So what are some of the security concerns that we should be thinking about?
The organizations that we serve are a wide variety, every industry, every size. We've got a select number of enterprise clients. We've got a select number of sort of mid-market clients. Traditionally, we have served regulated industries. And these are the industries that are under huge compliance requirements and face pretty severe penalties if they break those requirements. So think healthcare, banking, life sciences, insurance, state, local education, et cetera. And so really, we entered into this space because at the beginning of the maybe common generative AI boom, right, this is back in early 2023, all of a sudden ChatGPT becomes the fastest growing app in history. And my co-founder and I had come from a regulated world, specifically regulated financial services. We ran a venture studio inside a large fintech organization. And because of that, we had a network to a lot of the CIOs and chief information security officers in these companies. And we heard the same thing over and over and over again. And what are you doing with this generative AI? And the vast majority of them said, one of a couple different variants, but the core thesis was, number one, I'm facing huge downward pressure to do something with generative AI by my CEO, my board, my investors. But I'm also noticing that I cannot apply my traditional security policies in data loss prevention, expressions like that. I can't apply the same security policies in a way that I feel comfortable with. So what am I doing right now, Aaron? I'm doing nothing. And that really just struck us. These were the industries that we felt, if generative AI really proved to be kind of, I think, what it has proven to be, which is a technology that has busted the door open here to all sorts of new workflows and productivity and insights. These regulated industries were the ones that stood the best chance to gain something from it. These are traditionally older industries and organizations. And so Liminal was really based on the thesis that we could find a way to bring a compelling generative AI experience to these organizations in a way that satisfied the needs of these security individuals, the CIOs and the CISOs. So to your question, Sean, in terms of what do we think about? Well, I think it kind of breaks down to two different angles. And we took this directly from the feedback of our customers. The first one is very much focused on, I think, what we all could expect, which is the idea of sensitive private data and whether we are comfortable sending that information as part of an interaction with generative AI. So this could range from personally identifiable info, your name, your address, your birth date, healthcare information, credit information, etc. And the second really, it seemed like a bit of the first, but the second was the idea of intellectual property. There was a general concern that my organization's secret sauce was somehow going to be sent to these downstream generative AI tools in a way that would influence those tools to later on regurgitate that information to an unintended querier, if you will. So that was really what we stepped into. And I think, happy to dive into this more, our core thesis has held true that, number one, the world is becoming multi-model. These organizations, it's not just about ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot. The solutions, the models, the agents are exploding. We've all seen this. It's only getting bigger now that the DeepSeek news, 4 or 5 weeks ago came out. We knew that the future was going to be multi-model, and we knew that to do this well, we had to serve not only the needs of the security organization, but we had to make the end user feel like they were having the experience from generative AI that they expected. Well, one brief point I'll just give you here. Early on, we did a big study, sort of an anonymized paid study of workers in these regulated industries. And we found data that wasn't surprising, but it was kind of terrifying in that the vast majority of them were using some sort of generative AI. The vast majority of that vast majority were using generative AI regardless of the organization's policies. And a meaningful subset of that crowd were even using tools that the organization said, you are not allowed to use these tools. Now, I'm going to assume that the vast majority of frontline workers in these industries are not malicious people. They're just trying to get their job done. But what we found is that, and back to the point of we can serve security, but we also have to serve the user. if I build a solution that hinders you, it slaps your wrist, it tells you stop putting sensitive information in here, what are you going to do? You're going to get off your company network. You're going to go to a personal device and you're going to go back to the tools you've been using. We can't enforce a behavior change. So a lot in there, but just we saw a thin line where we had to serve both sides really well in a world where it's not just ChatGPT, it's now going like this, and it's only going to continue.
Super interesting, because there's pressure from CEOs are saying, we want this, or maybe investors are saying we want this, maybe customers are saying we want this. But then also employees want to use the technology because it, just makes your life easier. If you don't have to spend an hour trying to write up a document. You can have ChatGPT or some other LLM system generate a first draft for you, and then you can go off something like that. But then, of course, there are these two concerns, which the first one, I feel a lot of people, it's the first thing they think about, which is PII, sensitive data, things like that. You're not sure whether you should send that to a third-party API. But then this other one of IP also makes a lot of sense, and isn't one I hadn't really considered before. And I feel like, I don't know if this is true, but this is something that I heard, which is Walmart doesn't use AWS because Amazon is their biggest competitor. So I feel like, maybe it's a similar kind of thing with using these third-party APIs. So one thing you said was really interesting to me, which was the CIOs, they got this directive of, use GenAI, but they said their previous controls and policies were unable to kind of handle this new technology. Could you kind of give a little, some details into that,
Yeah.
shed some light on that?
Absolutely. I think what we discovered early on when a security professional, a CIO, CISO, or their staff looked at the problem of generative AI, the first natural place to look at, I mentioned data loss prevention, that's the tool chain that has existed forever, right? For identifying this information is sensitive, or it shouldn't be public, or it should be restricted. We're going to find a way to pull it back. Works beautifully. I think there's a lot of conversations. I know a lot of CISOs who would disagree that it is a one-all solution. Obviously, a lot of times it can be difficult to catch all the different types of sensitive information, et cetera. But I think the core idea that we ran across early on was that sort of blocking motion of a lot of DLP, which is, hey, Shaw, you entered a prompt, it's got your name in it, don't do that. And then that's all it does. That has sort of traditionally been the DLP motion. It's a blocking motion. It's a disabling motion. What was so interesting about generative AI was what we all know, that these large language models, as they come on the scene, what is their job? Their job is to figure out what is the statistically most likely next word in the sentence. And that if we are just introducing roadblocks, as we all know, LLMs are going to be very helpful. They're going to try to generate things. But if you are throwing blocks at them, you are increasing the likelihood that the output from them is, at a minimum, less effective, but at a maximum, introducing something harmful. And just one of those interesting kind of realizations that traditional blocking motions were very appropriate in the old world. Obviously, still very relevant today. But when we think about generative AI, it was not sufficient to just, again, restrict you, especially when that sensitive information, let's pretend you and I are bank employees and our job is to reach out to customers about new offers on our products. If we are interacting with generative AI in a way where we put in a bunch of information about a prospective customer, we get a blocking motion, and we get some gobbledygook back, did that really do anything for you and I? Did that lift a burden off our shoulders? Maybe, but likely not. Versus, no, if the output needs to be contextually relevant and accurate to the input, well, then you and I, we want to have this enable us. We want to have this boost our capabilities. That means the traditional blocking motion doesn't work. And incidentally, that was one of the ways that we started to really kind of speak in a compelling fashion to the CIOs and CISOs was, we know you, we come from your world. We know you don't want to be disablers in your organizations. I have never met a security professional who enjoys sending out an email about what apps the organization cannot use. Nobody wants to do that. It's just part of their job. We introduce a way that these organizations can say yes to generative AI. Not only is it something that satisfies their security needs, but finally, I don't have to just be a blocker with my existing blocking tech. I can now say, we've got a way that gives the user the outcome, and I can just know on my back end that I'm doing what I need to do to be auditable, observable, and compliant. So yeah, that's kind of why that realization was just so interesting. The world had to change here because restricting information doesn't work when you're trying to get meaningful actions out of generative AI.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the traditional approach is you have sensitive data. The policy is you don't share it with anyone. You can't use it with Gen AI tools. You can't share it to third parties and all that kind of stuff. But like you're saying, sometimes you need this sensitive information in order for the use case to work well. Like if you're doing sales and you're trying to like automate the like a cold outreach, you kind of need personalization involved in that, sales script to get the customer to respond. That's just like one use case, but I can imagine there are like countless use cases where you need information that, may be classified as sensitive in order for it to be valuable, in order to be practical. So just restriction, just blocking motion, as you're saying, is just not practical a lot of times.
That's right. Especially as we think about, I think about today, Liminal supports, I think 16 or 17 different providers of generative AI, large language model providers, agent providers, it's expanding all the time. And when we think about the typical organization, to your point, maybe some organizations start with, okay, here's the one model that everybody's going to use.
Right.
Again, these enterprises, well, sales and marketing needs this kind of model with this kind of access control. Research needs these 7 models plus this agent with different controls. And we just kind of started to quickly realize, okay, but both sides matter here. I've got a crucial set of tooling for the security organization, but I've also got to do something. To your point, you and I are sales reps, under quota, we're under deadline. Do you want to get a response back that says, "Dear Redacted, I'm excited to talk to you about Redacted," and that's not going to do anything for anybody. So it's a tricky balance, but certainly both is crucial.
Okay, so it's like this balancing act of the extreme cases, like you don't use any generative AI tools and your data is maximally secure. And then the other extreme is you use all the tools and you share any data, but now it's like your data is maximally insecure. So it's like trying to find that right balance in between. So that's what I want to start getting into now. So like what techniques, and I know like just looking at your company website, there are like a few different approaches that you guys talk about. And I kind of want to just like talk through them one by one. But how do you guys start to mitigate these security concerns? Like what are the different strategies that we can use? And I guess you can just like pick your favorite one or the most commonly used one, and we'll start from there.
Yeah, you betcha. I'll kind of, there are 2 that pop to mind. One of them is a very technologically interesting one that we're doing that just people talk about. But I'm actually going to start with one that is going to sound so obvious and so commonplace, and yet it ends up being so crucial to the equation. And that is access control over who can talk to what model. Turns out that is not something very straightforward to do in a compelling fashion. If you think about a typical organization of any size, different departments, different teams, different cross-functional groups that you have to worry about. And especially if you think, and the world becomes more multi-model. I, as an organization, I like OpenAI, but I got people who like Anthropic, but Perplexity's here. Well, what about DeepSeek? That's only going to get more and more. It turns out that one of the first crucial things is to be able to have centralized role-based access control for who in the organization should be able to have what types of interactions with which models or agents. Sounds so obvious, but really when you think about it, this is why a typical organization, they may be looking at ChatGPT Enterprise. They may be looking at Google Gemini. They may be looking at Microsoft Copilot. But right there, form or fashion is this little bit of a quandary. Number one, every provider is going to put their weight behind their models. And so a typical organization is going to have to buy all into that one, provider and their models. But number two, it ends up being highly unlikely over time that every single person needs to have access to every single model for every single use case. A security organization that I can just hear the alarm bells going off there, that it violates the whole kind of zero trust principle, right? Of giving you access that you are specifically supposed to have and nothing more. So it's a funny one, but that's where I always start. We don't maintain any sort of authentication because we have deep integrations into all the major identity platforms, and we allow users to configure what liminal functionalities, if you will, do they have access to all through the existing identity platforms. Yeah, super simple one, but it ends up being really crucial. Now, once you're in there, let's pretend you and I, let's pretend I'm the random sales guy with one model, hyper restrictive policies. You are a researcher, you got more models, different policies. One of the crucial things that we have to think about is the process of obfuscating sensitive data in a way that the downstream model can't fundamentally do anything with. But upon return, if I see references to that obfuscated information, we have a process called rehydration. It's the sophisticated way of reintroducing the sensitive information on top of that. So I think about this in two different ways. When you're in our platform, you're talking about, I want to talk to model X. Let's just pick OpenAI GPT-4o. Let's just pick that. We might say, okay, for these, we got 30, 40 categories of sensitive information. When I see these categories, I want to redact them. I want to effectively blank them out. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of sophisticated problems to solve there in terms of what redactions do you choose. There was a point at which in time where very early in the company's history, we would redact a category of information by replacing it with a single word, underscore, numerical index. So let's say Shaw and Aaron were both mentioned. Shaw might be person 0, Aaron might be person 1, as an example. Not identifiable to anybody else, but for our purposes, great. Well, it turns out there's a whole host of problems that can arise from that approach when you get to things like ages. There was a point at which somebody was saying, a customer of ours was saying, I was trying to find gift ideas for my 6-year-old son, and it was giving me toy ideas that were like relevant for a newborn. Well, it turns out we follow the HIPAA guidelines on how to deal with ages. A redaction, though, would turn my 6-year-old into age_0. Which LLM translated as, a 0-year-old child. That's just one example of like
interesting.
Info sounds simple, but holy moly, that's not simple. So there's that. The other policy we use a lot is something we call intelligent masking. And this is where we try to not just wipe out the sensitive information with some non-identifiable counterpart. We try to do something to remove the identifiability, but leave behind context that the LLM can use to generate a meaningful response. So simple couple here. If you think about Aaron Bach, 39 years old, well, that's very identifiable, very sensitive. But if you look at a framework like HIPAA, it'll say, you know what, you can switch somebody's age to their age range as long as there's no other identifiable information in that surrounding context. And so if that becomes person blah, 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 late 30s, that information now has been altered in such a way that the LLM, regardless of what they do with that data, and I just want to briefly mention that, security organizations, a lot of people will ask, well, OpenAI represents that they won't train their models on our data. Shouldn't that be good enough? I'll tell you, the vast majority of security organizations we talk to say, number one, you have to trust that that policy is exactly what it sounds like. There aren't any loopholes there. But number two, if you start talking about multiple providers, multiple agents and models, they all have different policies. We can't manage all these different relationships. So we just assume a downstream provider is going to train their model on your information. We just assume that outright. But that intelligent masking, if you think about Aaron Bach, 39 years old, getting turned to person blah, 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 late 30s, I don't really care what the model does with that. Can't deduce anything meaningful about that. But again, to go back to your example, if we are writing outbound communications as bank salespeople, the LLM may want to write the language differently to somebody in their late 30s versus somebody in their mid 60s, let's say.
Yeah.
Now, that back half of both of those, redaction masking, is the interesting part because the LLM may choose to represent those obfuscations differently when the response comes back to us. So we then have to intelligently try to detect where those obfuscations come back and rehydrate them again with the actual values that we originally found in the first place. Just one of those things that sounded so simple when we got into it. Holy moly, there's complexity in there.
Right. Yeah, because I'm already imagining, like, from a technical perspective, like, how do you implement this? There are at least two parts to it. There's like one, the text classification piece. Like, you have to be able to identify like what is sensitive. And then the second piece is, okay, I've identified this piece of text as sensitive. Now, what do I replace it with? So I don't know, I guess without giving away any of your secret sauce or anything like that, of course, but like, how do you guys approach these two parts of the redaction and the masking?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, the crucial bit, the crucial secret sauce, and this actually ties very nicely to the question about how is this different from kind of, I say old world DLP technology. When we detect sensitive information, it's easy to say that sentence and gloss over it, but it turns out the detection of sensitive information is difficult. And a lot of DLP technology will use things like fuzzy string matching, regular expressions, big databases with examples of all these concepts in the hopes that one of those, or maybe a combination of all of them, will be able to identify every permutation under the sun. Makes sense in a world when we think about like phone numbers generally have a common format, social security numbers. But when I get into a world of start simply names that are not terribly common, just as an example, I think of, Elon Musk has that son who I can't even pronounce it. It's a bunch of like Greek characters. That's not a name we've seen before. Or when we think about account numbers, an account number could be different for every industry under the sun, or even things like I'm representing, maybe Aaron's writing a prompt asking for medical information and being able to understand the difference between generic medical information versus medical information that represents a diagnosis of his own, the former being okay, but the latter being very HIPAA risky. That's where the world of fuzzy string matching and regular expressions just does not work. So when I want to talk about detecting sensitive information, we've got quite a compelling set of machine learning inside the platform that has been trained on hundreds of thousands of diverse examples, synthetic examples of all of these different categories of sensitive information, specifically not looking for here's what a name is, but here's the context in which a name or an account number or a medical diagnosis is likely to occur. It's fairly straightforward to think about that logically. I think for us, how we've been able to do that well, I staff an amazing machine learning group. We have an ability to take a handful of, let's say, synthetic data points for a new category. Let's say tomorrow we got to start protecting against Shaw's proprietary ice cream recipes. If you give me a couple examples of those, we've got tooling that can generate hundreds of thousands of diverse representations of that information. And about 24 hours later, our detection algorithm is updated in a fashion that we can now detect the concept of proprietary ice cream flavors. So again, the pieces are very clear there, but the ability to quickly generate large quantities of diverse training data, I keep saying synthetic. You could imagine in these industries, if I deal with a life sciences company and they want to protect against their proprietary small chain molecule formats, well, they're not going to give me actual small chain molecule formats. That represents their intellectual property. But if they roughly tell me, here's some examples of what it could look like, that's enough for us to generate a very diverse training data set to go after. So lots we could pull apart in there, but I think that's the core bit. Redaction masking is sort of what we do on the outbound and inbound data transfer. I think it all starts with, I'm looking at some sort of input and multimodal input in that respect. Do I see sensitive data irrespective of whether we think that's sensitive data based on the commonly understood definition of that category?
And then you just said multimodal, so it's not just text, it could be images, it could be audio. So now it gets really, really interesting.
Think about that example. We've used this before. Think about it, proprietary small chain molecule. Cool idea when it's in text, that it follows a syntax. But what if somebody's like uploading a picture of a corporate birthday party and on a whiteboard in the background, there's somebody wrote one down. We got to be able to find that kind of thing. So that's where we've got an approach where our detection algorithm is made up of multiple models trained for different purposes on different kind of input modalities, all for the purpose of saying, do I feel, this traditional machine learning, do I feel confident that what I'm looking at is a representation of XYZ category? And as a security platform, we take a very conservative approach there. Our kind of confidence threshold to identify something as sensitive is in fairly low. It's not. I don't need something to be 100% certain, because I would rather overprotect and have to learn how to help the user experience there. I'd rather do that for these industries than just be loose and fast and let actually sensitive things fly under the radar.
I imagine like a collection of models and maybe even still some like regular expression and fuzzy logic, a little bit of that as well to kind of allow you to do the detection. But then the next step is like deciding how to do the masking and the redaction. So I don't know, do you have is that part of the classification step, the identification step of identifying what should be masked versus what should be redacted? And then how do you make that replacement? Because at first you said person one, person two, or age zero, age one, which could cause some problems.
Absolutely. So to do that first, first part of the question is the redaction masking baked into that identification process? No. And the reason being, we give administrators on the platform the ability to change the rules, to say detection is kind of its own thing. But if Shaw, in your organization, this particular model you want to change, well, you know what? I'm actually okay with street addresses in this particular setting. So I'm going to set those to pass through. Account numbers, I'm not too worried about, but I want to pop up a little warning when I see an account number to give some information to an employee rather than outright blocking it. We give our customers the ability to change those policies. And here's the real power. You can change them globally, every model, every agent, every person, or as I said, you can change that based on the model or the agent that you're speaking to. So it could take a couple different forms. Maybe, again, talk about our Aaron beloved sales guy. Maybe we don't trust him a whole lot to not put a ton of sensitive information in there. So the model he gets access to is going to have more restrictive policies, where, who knows, maybe Shaw is a maybe more trustworthy individual, or maybe it doesn't have the same concerns around them. We can give you access to the same model with different policies. We even see situations where people will love policies, heavy restriction on how data is obfuscated when they're talking to public models. But let's say they deploy their own Llama 3.1 instance into Bedrock or SageMaker or something like that. In that case, they may say, look, we are good with any data going to this model. We feel comfortable. It's in our tenant. It's logically isolated. The networking is in place. In that particular case, great, we'll connect to that model and let's just tick all these policies to allow everything through. We come out of the box HIPAA compliant with those policies just because that tends to be a good place to start. Part of, I think, what we bring to our organizations is, hey, let's talk about your actual use cases, and is that kind of rigidity necessary in every case? So that's part one of your question. Part two, in terms of, man, kind of picking the algorithm or the heuristic of how to redact something, how to mask something. Some of those end up being easy. Again, turning an age into a range is fairly straightforward. What I would say that the trick, I guess, and I sort of alluded to this with that age zero example, you have to make sure that the alteration, whether it is just a pure redaction, a blank out nonsense counterpart, or whether it's a contextually relevant, if not identifiable counterpart, you have to make sure that what you're doing is not going to inadvertently influence the model's output. And so what we have under the hood there is some kind of surrounding system level prompting, some instructions in place around each of those replaced counterparts to kind of explain, hey, when you run across this, don't interpret it this way. I want you to specifically interpret, you see a person underscore XXXXA, XXXXB. Those are not actual person names, number one. Number two, those have been altered in such a way that you can treat them as secure and you should use them as such. I mention that because we see instances where, look at the Claude family from Anthropic. It's reasonable to assume, based on our experience with them, that they have trained those models to be very cautious. Such that if you and I were saying, okay, let's write an outbound sales email to Claude, blah, blah, blah. A lot of times Claude will respond with, well, I can't really do anything with personal data. So I'll give you some ideas on how you could write a sales email. They're doing the right thing. So we have to do some work with Claude in that particular case to say, hey, go ahead and understand that our data has already been cleansed. It's going to take this format for these categories. And so when you see it, you can trust that you can just respond as if it is safe to do so. As we do all these policies, it's not just a matter of wipe it out or change it.
Yeah.
Maintaining the integrity through that entire chain is a challenge for sure.
It's not only just like a replacement, like you're saying, or like a literal masking. You're also updating the prompt with in some way to kind of let the model know. And then you saying that about Claude is interesting because maybe these prompts or like basically this whole flow is going to be different for different models.
Which is, that, Shaw, is what keeps, it's like the most exciting thing and the most terrifying thing. We've got a very robust integration layer for all the providers we talk to. We have set a standard in place to please, let's not have a bunch of custom logic all over the place. And I think we've done a pretty good job, but I can tell you, you pop into, the section where we're talking to OpenAI, there are a couple things that are different.
Yeah.
And this is a whole separate topic here about how our engineering team works, but we're very good about when that happens, we get together and we kind of hammer on it for a little bit and say, okay, do we think that this alteration for this specific provider represents a manifestation of some general problem that we need to solve?
Yeah.
Or are we just going to be in this position where we're maintaining all these one-offs for all these providers? Haven't run into that yet, thankfully. But that's my nightmare, is one day we're going to open and go, oh God, our code is a bunch of if-else type of stuff.
Or when, I don't know, OpenAI does an update to GPT 4.0 and now the model kind of behaves differently in a certain set of use cases, and then maybe you have to go back and make
One thing
updates.
I'd love to just highlight there too, and I'm glad you brought it up, that giving instructions to the model. We read articles all the time about prompt engineering. Is it dead? Is it the new wave of engineering? There was a time early on in our history where I was reading LinkedIn posts about how prompt engineers were going to be making $500,000 a year, all this stuff. I think what we have deduced is that as the transformer model generation has grown more mature, and as reasoning models like O1, O3 Mini, DeepSeek have come online, they're getting a lot better in terms of there isn't the same maybe hardcore necessity to prompt engineer, but there sure is different quality in the outputs based on how well your prompt is written. You think about your downstream employees in these industries, bank employees, hospital administrators, wealth managers. These are not necessarily people who are going to know how to write a good prompt. Most of these employees, we see them treating generative AI like a search engine. So they put in one thing and hope that that one thing does what they need. If not, there's a risk that they walk away. So another big element of the user experience in our platform is giving administrators the ability to change a lot of the tuning under the hood, but in general, making it so that when bank employee, hospital administrator, whoever submits a prompt, we are putting some common sense instructions in place for that model with the belief, number one, that individual user may or may not have that technical awareness, but number two, maybe they shouldn't need to have that awareness. They're trying to get their job done. So why do we need them to become prompt engineers? And that's a thing I'm particularly passionate about, is ensuring that our platform gives really good outcomes. It's doing a lot of that, what we know to be good about prompt engineering under the hood. We don't pass that burden along to users. Another simple thing that I just think gets overlooked really quickly.
Yeah, and I was going to ask about that as well. And you alluded to it in the beginning, where the kind of first thought with integrating GenAI into a company might be this blocking motion. So basically just restricting usage. And so I feel like there's this tension between like security and like user interface. And maybe this prompt engineering is like another version of it, where the prompts that you guys are writing in the back end or including with the masking or the redaction is something that plays a role in the user experience. So how can you make this balance where you're making it secure, but you're also improving the usability and the user experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's hard to do. I'll just say that it's hard to do. The way we do it, it was sort of born out of early on. We had several people, advisors and friends of ours who were in the security space, say some form of security tools are built by security people for security purposes. And buried in that statement was a lot of options, a lot of things I can dial and toggle, and it's not like I enjoy doing that. And so we took the attitude early on that we were going to approach this from the angle of user experience first. And when you say that, it's easy to think, well, you're choosing user experience in place of security. By no means. We kind of, unknown to everybody, we were working from both angles. But every time we talk about a new experience, we start from the lens of user experience. What is a typical end user of this generative AI platform going to see and experience? And then we kind of wind the technology back from there. We employ an incredible product design team. They have a long experience in modern kind of application development experience standards. And again, I'm not knocking security or information tooling out there. There's plenty of good-looking tools out there. For ours, there is such a dance in terms of providing meaningful functionality without overwhelming a user. Great example, early on, one of the first iterations of the product, when we would put in a prompt, and you put in a prompt into Liminal, it starts to underline things that it's identified as sensitive. early on, we had all sorts of configurability right there in the prompt. You could change which policies, you could get more information, you could do all this stuff related to the sensitive information that was detected. And we thought we were pretty cool. We thought, man, look at all this great information, like people are gonna go nuts. And what we found in sort of experimentation and with our early users, universally overwhelmed, deer in the headlights, not really seeing the value. And I think that was one of the moments that really stress tested that core principle of not user design, but user experience. If we think something is really cool and it looks great and it provides all this functionality and it makes sense, but our typical user is overwhelmed by it, then it does not work. And we're going to let go of our ego about how much we love that thing. And so what do? We switch to a different kind of representation. There's just sort of a gentle underlying of the terms, but that's it. Right? And it's intended to communicate to the user. Found some sensitive stuff, but we're not hindering you from submitting your prompt. And look, will that serve everybody forever? I don't know. We'll probably need to kind of over time continue to evolve to have different modes for the type of user who's using it. But I will always prioritize, we want to do a new thing. What is our user going to think about that? Instead of what do we need to secure there? That matters,
right?
Not initially.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like this balance because you are like a startup, but it's also a security company. So you want it to be user friendly. You want it to be differentiated from existing products, but you also want it to do the core value proposition, which is
that's right. And hence why when you get into our platform, you don't see a ton of language around, generative AI concepts, trainings, embeddings, temperature, all this stuff. You see it represented and reflected in the linguistics and the experience that a typical employee or a typical cybersecurity person is used to seeing. And therein, I think, I'm sure we talked long about this, all the time, the executives we interact with they are still looking for what is the ROI on generative AI in my organization. What that tells me is, among other things, is that we have to do a good job if we're going to build a security platform to not just take cool technology and put cool technology to do a cool job in front of you. You have to resonate with it. We need to translate it to your language so that in a day-to-day setting, you can actually deploy these use cases rather than be just lost in this morass of what generative AI is. Again, it sounds so simple, but it's overlooked quickly as we start to just build products, and I think that's a mistake.
So I will call out, we will do Q&A. So if you guys got questions, drop it in the YouTube chat or the LinkedIn chat, and then we'll throw them up on the screen here. But while those are coming in, so one thing you talked about earlier is if companies self-host and they don't even care what they send to the model. So what are the pros and cons there? Like, why not just spin up your own local LLM environment or something like that, and then just, forsake any security concerns because you can just, you can do it freely. So I don't know, how do you think about that? How do you see customers making that decision and kind of deciding on that?
Yeah, it's a fair question, right? Well, the tooling is, you and I can go download old Llama on our laptops and get an LLM running in seconds. Couple different things that I think about there. Number one, the typical employee in these organizations is not, I don't want to be gentle about how I say this, they're not to the level of tech savviness around generative AI that you and I and maybe your listeners are. They just aren't. So why not? Number one, it represents a sort of drag on the organization to add an application development initiative that's outside the business's core purpose. Now, look, some organizations and some industries are going to want to build proprietary stuff themselves. That's just what they want to do. And they've got the capacity, they've got the capability to do that. Wonderful. We're working with a customer currently in a healthcare adjacent space who's built a really cool looking internal chatbot. And yet they're a customer of ours. And very recently, I just had a candid conversation of, I'd love to hear, but you got this really cool tool. Like, why do you need us? Or why do you want us? And the answer is not surprising, but it was very direct. And it was, we have a small team. They've done a wonderful job on this tool for what it is today. I, leader, do not want them putting their time towards that. We have so many other mission critical things to the business. I'd rather pull something off the shelf that does what we do here with the capabilities that we introduce around observability and governance. I'd rather do that, and then I can unlock these people to put their time towards more important things. So that's just an interesting thing. I get lost in this too, Shaw, where I think, shoot, I can download and run models myself. I have to constantly remember I'm not reflective of our typical user in these
Right.
industries.
Well, it sounds fundamentally the build versus buy decision because, maybe technical folks like us, we like to build. So that's our first instinct. But a lot of times, maybe it just doesn't make sense to build every single
I think
component
so.
yourself.
And there's a whole other world we talked about generative AI in application development. I think there is such a large gap too between I made a cool proof of concept on my laptop versus this is now a deployed service that my 50,000 person company relies on. Yikes. Um, One other thing that I think is important, why would something like a liminal matter in a world where we just deploy our own models? Again, the number of models, the number of agents, it went from this, now it's like this. I think at last count, there were hundreds of thousands of large language models on the Hugging Face leaderboard. That's to say nothing of all the agents and all that stuff. It's only going to keep going that way. Everybody, myself included, who would love a silver bullet, one model to fix it all, ain't going to happen. Now, with that said, one of the values of a common platform for those end users, remember, these are individuals who are, they're creating appointments for healthcare patients. They are writing outreach emails. It's downstream frontline people. If you think about, I started with OpenAI, but I kind of like Anthropic. Whoa, we got Copilot Studio in the mix. Well, DeepSeek. If an organization keeps wanting to do this stuff, there is a sincere drag on the organization having to train its users on new tools, new paradigms, new experiences every time this changes, and we think it's going to keep changing a lot. If I throw in there that in addition to all that, I might have a private model, and I could slap a UI on top of that. You bet, totally could. And you know what? That may make sense for a lot of organizations. If you are at all of the belief that one model or that one experience will need to evolve and do other things, beautiful to train your users on one experience, knowing that the guts of it will change over time, but the experience will remain the same. And you can continue this flywheel of getting them using generative AI for the use cases that matter for you versus, hey, Sean, Aaron, here we have 7 new models. Here's the 3 new interfaces to talk to them. Here's the 7 use cases for those. At which point you and I go, I'm trying to do my job. I can't focus on this right now. So there's another reason of private model, public model. To me, there's value in all of it. And there's tremendous value in getting the users used to one way of engagement versus.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Now that you kind of described, everything about liminal and all, like how it works, and it just makes more and more sense to me. Like this is a thing. So I don't know. I feel like I'm excited to see how your company grows. Okay, so we had a question from our Discord, so I'm just going to throw that up on the screen now. What inspired the development of the liminal engine? How does it differentiate from other data protection solutions in the generative AI space?
It's a great question. Early on, what inspired the development? Well, initially, I almost ran afoul of believing, well, no product could possibly be good as what we could build. And so what almost prompted it was, I can go do this better. Thank goodness we didn't just charge off on my thinking there. What really did start to inspire it early in the company's history, before we even started building any product, we did a big sort of data analysis, feeding a kind of standardized data set full of sensitive information amongst the common DLP providers. Why did we pick DLP? Well, at the time, and I think even today, when you think about a typical security organization, mid-market or enterprise in a regulated industry, DLP is what they're used to. So it's a lingo that they already speak. The benchmarking that we did, and it was like 5 or 6, maybe more providers. On average, if we went through our common, at the time it was just PII, so we used the kind of the Stanford PII data set as our training test bed. Best case, these solutions were like 60% accurate in detecting sensitive information on these data sets. And so before the liminal engine would evolve to what it was, our first thought was, people are comfortable with 60% detection accuracy? Are you kidding me? How can people be okay with that? And we started to talk to CISOs trying to find out what's the catch here. And every one of them just sort of said, yeah, I don't like it either, but these are big names and this is what I got. We just thought, oh my goodness. So that little thread started this moment of, okay, then let's what do we mean by accuracy? And incidentally, many of your listeners will know, you can test against recall, you can test against precision. There are different metrics for how you determine accuracy of a detection result in an ML model. We use F1, which is a blending of the two. It really makes it so that we can't game the system with too many false positives or negatives. But we set ourselves a benchmark of, okay, we want to be at least 95% accurate on an F1 score across all of the categories that we say we represent. And we pulled the thread initially. DLP is terrible. Why? We set that benchmark for ourselves. And that's what really started this process of realizing building our own kind of detection algorithm on this network ensembled model approach was going to be the best way to serve our customers. And yeah, it's not 100%. I'd love to get to 100%. I don't know if that will ever fully be possible, but walking into an organization that is used to 60%, 95% sounds amazing. So, how does it differentiate? There's all sorts of different solutions. There's all sorts of different ways to detect sensitive information. I think what is powerful about ours is twofold. Number one, what I described previously, where we train our series of models on high quantities of very diversified synthetic examples of all these categories. As everybody knows, the more diverse the data is, the less overfitting, the more likely it is that you will detect the concept and not just a representation of it. But number two, we built the algorithm such that we could snap additional models into it. I think that's a little differentiated. And we did that because we haven't talked a ton about intellectual property specifically. Intellectual property means something different to every organization under the sun. Is it a patent document in a PDF? Is it an image of a small chain molecule? Is it an audio file? All this stuff. We believed that there would be a world in which our algorithm would need to accommodate models that were valuable for everybody, and then maybe models where customer X comes along and says, this is our data. It is specific to us. I don't want anybody else in your customer base even knowing about these. Our architecture is such that we can snap additional models in and kind of get them all as voters for that specific customer's needs.
Interesting.
So it ended up being a very elegant solution. I still go back to my initial self. Glad we didn't just charge down the build road. And then early on, we really tried to pressure test what are people used to in this space.
Nice. So that brought up another question that has nothing to do with security and things like that. But how did you guys figure out or discover that this was something that people actually were willing to pay you money for? Like, how did you validate this initial product idea?
That's a great question. We were very fortunate to partner early on with an organization, maybe people will be aware of High Alpha. We had come from a venture studio world, my co-founder and I. High Alpha is one of the preeminent venture studios in the world. Very good at getting access to the right stakeholders for the purpose of pressure testing ideas. Look, a long story there. What I would say is over time, how we've packaged things, how we price things, of course it's changed. But early on, being a part of a venture studio and having access to their resources and their connections to be able to put even, early stage lo-fi prototypes in front of people and say, what do you think about this? Two of our customers, big organizations, one's very large life sciences, one's large in healthcare. I remember early on kind of pitching those lo-fi wireframes to them. Of course, I wanted to win the business, but early on the conversations were all about, I'm just looking for your feedback. Is this something that'd be useful to you? And as we all, I think, know, entrepreneurship is in some part luck. We had a resonant message from day one, and we happened to just be in the right place at the right time. And so again, that's had to evolve over time. That initial idea needed to evolve before we could really say we found a fit across our industries. But we were very lucky to be a part of the High Alpha family early on, and they were incredibly beneficial to us in terms of getting us in front of the people who could give us really candid feedback directly from those industries that we intended to serve.
Okay, that's awesome. So you'd build some MVP, some prototype or whatever, and then just like hop on a call, do a demo and get the reaction.
That's it. This is one of the, I was talking about it with a partner of ours this morning. This is one of the things that I have, maybe many entrepreneurs have. It's so, again, simple, so easy to let go of. The tendency is to believe, here's the thing I'm going to build. And what about this feature? And oh, this would be cool too. And versus the simplest thing to do is to do something that's minimally viable, put it in front of somebody and let their feedback guide you. And do that enough times and you'll get messaging. And sometimes the messaging is, this thing sucks. It's no good. And okay, like rather than feeling stung by that, we ought to be grateful that we learned that early on before we built a ton of product. I think it's the most valuable thing you can do is quick iterate on something, put it in front of a customer. Let me walk you through this and get your feedback. I am curious if a lot of entrepreneurs, myself included, might struggle with that because it can be challenging to get feedback on something you are so certain in. and whoops, it's not landing with your crowd.
And I feel like a lot of times maybe people don't even know who their customer is. They just build like this cool thing and they're like, who do I show this to? But I guess you guys had the foresight. You guys kind of knew at the outset like who you needed to talk to. Or maybe, I don't know, what was that process like?
Yeah, well, beneficial. And I credit Steve Walchek. He's our CEO. He's my co-founder and my good friend. When we were at that large fintech company, he in particular had connections with CIOs, CISOs, executives in financial services and banking, but it really did stretch across a variety of regulated industries. We got lucky there. We got lucky believing that this new technology was racing forward, and he just happened to have enough conversations where these, especially security executives, were saying, "I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole." Right? You hear that enough times, and you start to think, well, I'm making a bet here that generative AI is going to be a big deal. I'm hearing that these industries that I think could really benefit from it aren't touching it. You hear that enough times and you start to think, well, maybe that's where I should go. Again, I think one of the challenges we face even today as generative AI evolves in industry, is it a cybersecurity thing? Is it a legal and compliance or governance thing? Is it some organizations are building AI offices? Is it just a pure AI thing, whatever that means? Even how our product and how we sell is evolving to encompass different customer profiles and different personas. But we got lucky early on just hearing enough of not touching it, not touching it. And it was in a space that we felt like amidst the sea of AI-powered stuff that was starting to appear, we could have a compelling message around, you want to use it, we want to help you use it in a way that makes you feel safe.
Aaron, I've learned so much in this conversation, not just about AI security, but even at the end, the journey of building Liminal and learning more about how you guys developed this company. Thanks so much. Thank you guys who joined live and watched. Thank you to the one question from our Discord person. So we do have more podcasts coming up this month and next month, all around entrepreneurship, building products, and also freelancing. So if you're interested in those, check out the upcoming events. And then once again, Aaron, thank you so much. And I will see you guys on the next one. Take care.